Welcome back, everyone. In this video, we're going to break down Context API versus Redux at a very high level. I know we haven't actually written any code for Redux, but at least we've worked with reducers and Context API, so here we should be able to find some kind of knowledgeable ground when it comes to the theoretical parts of Context API versus Redux. And it's important to understand these theoretical differences when we start coding out Redux, so we at least can understand where Redux sits inside of this whole ecosystem much more clearly. I want to note that there's really only two main differences inside when it comes to Redux versus Context API, and it has to do with the accessibility as well as the flow of data. So accessibility here is the accessibility of the data, and that's what we are going to start with. So let's imagine we have our application here. I've stripped it down a little bit so that it's a little more clear. And what we have is just the app at the top level, and then we have our shop preview on the left and the cart on the right. Now, the key thing I want you to remember here is that the shop is on the left and the cart is on the right. We have three different contexts right now also wrapping around the entire application: cart context, categories context, and user context. These three contexts are wrapped around the entire application because any component can access the values in these contexts. But in reality, this doesn't actually have to be the case with context. Context is kind of just like a component. You can actually wrap it around smaller portions of the application, and only that part has access to that context. For example, with the categories context, only the shop page really needs access to what's inside the categories context. As far as the components in the shop are concerned, they're the only ones that actually call the use context hook to reach into that context and pull out the values. The components on the right side, which is our cart, might actually receive those products somehow through the product cards, but in reality, it doesn't actually itself reach into the categories context, so it does not actually need to be wrapped by the categories context. If you are a child of categories context, you will have access to the context. If you are a sibling of the categories context or a parent of the categories context, then you do not have access to that context. Now let's take a quick look inside of our application to understand how that works. So here we are inside of our index.js. As we know, we have this categories provider, and this categories provider is what allows us to reach inside the application to get the different products that we have. The only parts of the application that are reliant on the categories context, we can take a quick look. Everywhere where we call use context, we must pass it this categories context. So here we see that inside of our different components, we're only using it in two places: the categories preview and the categories component. If we remember, both of these are only components that live inside of the shop page, both the categories preview and the category. What we can do is we can actually take this categories provider and just wrap it around the shop component, like so, as a parent. In fact, actually, let's wrap the entire routes object inside of categories provider. The only thing we haven't done is we have not actually imported it in. So let's do that as well. Let's import in our categories provider. So we need to go up into our context folder, our categories context, and then we save this. And inside of our index, we can remove this. Well, we'll comment it out for now because we want to put it back. So now when we save this and we look inside of our shop component, what we should notice is that in theory, our code should still work. So here, let's go to our application. Let's go to our shop. Look at that. We still have access to this context. We can still add our components and add items inside of our go to checkout. So nothing is broken here. But one thing that I want you to notice is that if I try and access this categories context from outside of these two routes, meaning that let's imagine that we're trying to access it from, let's say, a different component. Let's say our cart, for example. We know that our cart lives outside of this shop component. It's a sibling. So here, what I can do is I'm going to say, okay, give me the categories context as well. And I want to pull this from categories context. There it is. And I'm going to say const categories map, which we know is something that we get, equals use context. And then I call categories context. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to console.log categories map. If we save this and we go back to our application, when we open up our cart dropdown, we see that we do log an empty object. But what you'll notice is that we see all of our other products. This means that our categories context has updated, and therefore there's a categories map object. However, why is it that our cart dropdown is still an empty object? Well, the reason for this is because categories context has an initial value, which is this. But what happens is that this object never updates. The hooking into all of the actual updates that happens from the provider getting the value and then this component updating lives tangential to what the cart dropdown has access to. So while it's true that we may be able to derive the default value, the initial value of the categories context, we cannot access any updated values from that provider. So this is how we've managed to now segment the accessibility of this actual context value from our provider inside of the categories context by wrapping it around the shop component. So this is one way. We can keep this code if we want. If you want to do this and you want to make sure that only the appropriate portions of your application have access to these respective providers, you can definitely do that. For me, though, I do believe that at some point as this application scales, we're probably going to want to have access to these categories in other places of the application, but it's very easy for you to move your code around and figure out where you don't want access. So I'm just going to revert everything that we've done here back to what we had. I'm just getting rid of all these providers. And there we go. So that's really about accessibility. With context, we are able to wrap the appropriate portions of our application and isolate the accessibility to only the children of where it is that we have wrapped our providers. Now, the difference between context and Redux is that Redux will always wrap the entire application. With this, just like how we have currently set up inside of our contexts, you have the same access to the Redux store, which is where all of our state is stored from the entire application. So it may not look different from context, but the thing is that you opt out of the choice. With Redux, your application will always have access. This is by design because it's called global state management. Global implying all of the different internal components of your application have access to the Redux store. Now, the Redux store itself is what handles the actual data, which we're going to talk about in the next video. But this is one of the key things I want to highlight to you about the differences between context and Redux. And along the way, we also learned about something new with context that we can do. There are times where you only want to wrap parts of your application inside of context and not the entire thing. So now that we're armed with this knowledge, let's talk about data flow.